Greetings, friends. It's lovely to see so many faces of people that I now rarely get to see in person. I was asked to lead a Valentine's service about love poetry, which is a good choice in that I love poetry, but less than great in that I don't love some of the famous classic love poems in English of times gone by. Many of these love poems by English masters are poems of their own time only, and their language is quite old-fashioned, and they're fancied up with meter and rhyme, and now seem overly formal. I appreciate the craft of these poems, but I often find all the artistry, with some exception, too busy. I prefer poems that are clear windows into the poet's heart rather than almost puzzles to be solved. Some of these poems are the kind that make high school students turn away from poetry. I want to say something else rather judgmental about the English love poetry of earlier centuries. There are, of course, many beautiful exceptions. However, in those older poems, it's usually a male poet putting a woman on a pedestal, objectifying her with far too much focus on her physical beauty. Youth, as well as lifespans in that time of the world, were far shorter. And so maybe it made sense then to profess to the virgins to make much of time, as Robert Herrick did in the 17th century. This is the first stanza only. Gather ye rosebuds while ye may, old time is still a-flying, and this same flower that smiles today, tomorrow will be dying. My opinionated viewpoint is that romantic love is often addictive and delusional. Joni Mitchell sang, "It's love's illusions I recall. I really don't know love at all." I remember when I was younger, we talked about love junkies. These were the people who they loved love more than they loved their supposed loved ones. Nowadays, young people talk about love bombers. A love bomber loves obsessively without boundaries and pours so much praise and attention and so many gifts on the supposedly beloved that the beloved gets kind of lost in the rush. Of course, there are many admirable older love poems. Who could deny Shakespeare's genius, for instance, in Sonnet 116 that often gets quoted at weddings? Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments. Love is not love, which alters when it alteration finds, or bends with the remover to remove. Back to my accusation of the early poems being voices of the patriarchy. In 1904, Rilke began to hope for a change. He wrote in his letters to a young poet, and I quote, "Someday there will be girls and women whose name will no longer mean the mere opposite of the male, but something in itself, something that makes one think not of any compliment, but only of life and reality, the female human being. This advance will transform the love experience, which is now filled with error, will change it from the ground up and reshape it into a relationship that is meant to be between one human being and another, no longer one that flows from man to woman." I believe that the someday Rilke spoke of is to a degree here now. Today, there's a much better chance of equality and mutuality in love relationships. Numerous websites online list the many forms of love. Each listing differs in numbers and descriptions. Many forms are obvious, like eros and agape, platonic love, unrequited love. Some sites list as many as 17 types, but one I didn't know was called Pragma. I didn't know it by that name, at least. Years ago, I read that pop psychologist Robert Johnson, who wrote these books, He, She, and We. And I always remember in We, where he spoke of stirring the oatmeal love. And I think that's pragma, really. And pragma is practical love. It's also called enduring love. It's characterized by commitment, and it's often present in long-term romantic relationships, old, comfortable, mutually respectful marriages. There are a number of these admirable, sweet, and mutually supportive long relationships within our congregation. Many of us remember the classic example of Chet and Vera Calm, who are no longer with us. I love to think of relationships like theirs, in which the participants seem to be true partners. I can't help but think of Rosalind and Jimmy Carter or the Obamas. Among poets, I think particularly of Wendell Berry and his wife Tanya, and W.S. Merwin and his wife Paula. Their love poems are a far cry from the old poems to rosy-cheeked maidens. I apologize for mostly speaking of male-female relationships. There are, of course, great numbers of famous bisexual, lesbian, and gay poets. Audre Lorde, Elizabeth Bishop, Mary Oliver, June Jordan, Kay Ryan, Walt Whitman, Lorca, Ginsberg, O'Hara, to name only a few. Increasingly, we see pragma among notable long-term same-sex couples. I also love accounts of heterosexual marriages in which one partner transitions and the other stays with them, saying, it wasn't their gender I loved their soul. There are, of course, countless poems from parents to children, but I want to get back to pragma, that long committed love, and to Wendell Berry and W.S. Merwin. Wendell Berry wrote this to his wife, Tanya, after their children were grown up and moved out into their own lives. This is called The Blue Robe by Wendell Berry. How joyful to be together, alone as when we first were joined in our little house by the river long ago, except that now we know each other as we did not then. And now, instead of two stories fumbling to meet, we belong to one story that the two joining made. And now we touch each other with the tenderness of mortals who know themselves. How joyful to feel the heart quake at the sight of a grandmother, old friend in the morning light, beautiful in her blue robe. And this Merwin poem is from when he and Paula were even older, and time seemed to be a rushing current, and their time together was running out. It's called Here Together by W.S. Merwin. These days, I can see us clinging to each other as we are swept along by the current. I am clinging to you to keep you from being swept away, and you are clinging to me to keep me from being swept away from you. We see the shores blurring past as we hold each other in the rushing current. The daylight rushes unheard far above us. How long will we be swept along in the daylight? How long will we cling together in the night? And where will it carry us together? In our elder years, we increasingly lose many of those we've loved, parents, siblings, partners, but we go on loving them after they die, don't we? As the wisdom goes, what is grief but love persevering? There are many poems of love and grief combined. Ted Kooser said that when grief is heavy, so heavy that we need to set it down, poetry is a good place to set it. Rumi said, love is the bridge between you and everything. In this time of our country and the world, love must be much bigger than just between couples. The threats are huge. We are called upon to love widely and deeply, love nature, our community, morality, justice, It's a time of devastating changes. This is a poem by Rosemary Watala Traumer called In a Dangerous Time. I think of the bones of the unsung rib cage, the way they protect the heart, how bone too is living, how it constantly renews and remakes itself. I think of how ribs engage with other ribs to expand, to contract. And because they do their solid work, they allow the heart to float. This is what I want to do, to be a rib in this body of our country, to make a safe place for love. There is so much now that needs protection. I want to be that flexible, that committed to what is vital, that unwilling to yield. I hope to see all the love poems of the future become the literature of a more encompassing love, love not just for one another, but to honor threatened nature and the great mysteries, which are, after all, whatever God is. God is love, right? Love is all there is, or at least it should be the thread that sews it all together. It is up to us in these trying times to keep following the love thread, sewing the love thread, and keep making, like the ribs, a safe place for love. Thank you.